I didn't say a word when the HOA president screamed about trespassing. Her voice was sharp, loud enough to echo off the polished walls of the conference room, but I kept my face calm, my hands steady as I slid the official reclamation order across the polished oak table. The paper felt heavier than it was. Pages upon pages of legal language, meticulously gathered evidence, and county records dating back decades. The room, once filled with her angry shouts, suddenly fell into an uncomfortable silence, thick with tension. Behind her, their lawyer shifted uneasily, his fingers tightening around the edge of his chair as if it were the last solid thing in the world. I met their eyes without flinching, not needing to raise my voice or make a scene. Pause. The truth was a quiet but powerful weapon, and in that moment it spoke louder than any outburst. They had tried to charge me $300 for building a simple gravel road on my own land, a road I built to access a part of my property they conveniently ignored existed. But buried deep in the archives, tucked away in yellowed deeds and forgotten county maps, was proof that the land and the road were mine, legally and unequivocally. That gravel wasn't just dirt and stones leading into the trees anymore. It was the boundary line that erased their false claims and reclaimed everything they thought they owned. Watching the color drain from the president's face and the lawyer's trembling hands, I realized the fight wasn't just over a road. It was over control, authority, and respect. Pause. And for the first time, the scales had tipped. Size. I truly wasn't trying to start anything when I bought that land, and that's the part that still feels important to say out loud. Didn't move there to make a statement or challenge anyone's authority. I moved there because I was tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. After years of grinding through city life, deadlines, traffic, and noise that never really shuts off, I wanted something quieter and more honest. The land had belonged to my grandfather, and fixing up his old cabin felt less like a project and more like a return. It sat right on the edge of a sleepy subdivision, far enough removed to feel private but close enough that I didn't feel isolated. Tall pines crowded the property line, like they were guarding it. And after a rain, the air carried that deep, clean smell of wet earth and sap that makes you breathe slower without realizing it. I imagined slow mornings, weekends spent fishing at the creek, and evenings where the loudest sound was wind moving through leaves. I wasn't chasing luxury or control. I was chasing quiet. Pause. The cabin itself wasn't impressive by any real estate standard. The driveway was rough gravel, uneven in places, and the porch sagged just enough to remind you it had been there a long time. The paint peeled, the roof needed work, and the windows rattled when storms rolled through. But every worn board felt familiar, like it remembered the people who'd come before me. I liked waking up early, making coffee while the fog still hung low over the trees, and stepping outside to listen to the world wake up. Birds, insects, the distant sound of water moving over rocks. It was the kind of peace that doesn't announce itself. It just settles into your bones. In the evenings, I'd sit on that crooked porch with a mug in my hands, watching the sun disappear behind the hills, feeling something loosen inside me that had been tight for years. That land wasn't an investment or a flex. It was a refuge. Pause. And maybe that's why the conflict caught me so off guard. I wasn't attending HOA meetings, campaigning for influence, or paying attention to neighborhood politics. I didn't want to tell anyone how to live, and I didn't expect anyone to tell me how to live either, especially on land that had been in my family long before most of those houses existed. I kept to myself, waved when people passed, and minded my business. All I wanted was the freedom to repair what needed fixing, walk my land without interference, and enjoy the quiet I'd worked so hard to earn. I wasn't trying to push boundaries or challenge rules. I just wanted peace, ownership in the truest sense of the word, and the simple dignity of being left alone on what was mine. Pause. The first sign that things weren't going to stay peaceful came so casually that I almost laughed at it at first. Walked outside one morning with a cup of coffee still steaming in my hand and saw a bright yellow notice taped crookedly to my garage door, flapping slightly in the breeze like it didn't quite belong there. It accused me of unauthorized exterior repairs, specifically because I had patched a small leak in the cabin roof the weekend before, not replaced the roof, not altered the structure, just patched a leak that had been letting rain drip onto the floorboards. According to the notice, any exterior work, no matter how minor, required prior HOA approval, a submitted form, and written consent. Because I hadn't waited for their permission to stop water from coming into my own cabin, I was officially in violation. I stood there rereading it, genuinely trying to figure out if this was a mistake or some kind of joke. My land, my cabin, a fine for basic maintenance. The absurdity of it made my stomach tighten in a way I didn't expect. Pause. What bothered me even more was that it wasn't even their jurisdiction. I'd read the HOA charter when I bought the property, not obsessively, but carefully enough to know its limits. Their authority stopped at common areas and specific parcels within the subdivision. My land wasn't one of them. It never had been. The cabin predated the HOA by decades. The roof I fixed didn't overlook a shared street or affect anyone else's view. None of it made sense. And when something doesn't make sense on paper, it usually means someone is counting on you not pushing back. I told myself it was probably an overreach by someone new, maybe a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a quick conversation. I peeled the notice off the door, folded it, and set it on the kitchen table. Still more puzzled than upset. Pause. Then the letters started coming. The next one warned me that a small gravel path I'd laid down to reach the creek was considered an unauthorized structure and violated an obscure landscaping clause I'd never seen referenced before. The path wasn't decorative or disruptive. It was practical, a narrow strip of gravel to keep me from slipping on wet dirt when I walked down to the water. But according to them, it altered the aesthetic continuity of the neighborhood. Reading that line felt surreal. There was no continuity. To begin with, every property around me looked different, fenced differently, landscaped differently. The rule seemed less like a guideline and more like a weapon they could point wherever they wanted. At first, I assumed I must have missed a meeting or an update, something procedural that would explain the sudden scrutiny. But each letter grew sharper in tone, less informative and more threatening, stacked with vague deadlines and escalating fines. Pause. That was the moment confusion gave way to something colder. Not anger, at least not yet. But a sinking realization that this wasn't about compliance or communication. It was about control. They weren't guiding me. They were probing, testing how much pressure it would take before I folded. Every notice felt less like governance and more like harassment dressed up in legal language. They micromanaged my land with rules that shifted depending on who enforced them, citing clauses without context and authority they didn't actually have. I hadn't asked for this fight, hadn't invited attention, and hadn't broken any real rule that mattered. But standing there with those letters spread across my table, it became painfully clear that whether I wanted trouble or not no longer mattered. I was already in it. Pause. At first, I genuinely believed this could be resolved with a few calm conversations and some basic clarity. I wasn't looking for a fight, and I certainly wasn't interested in humiliating anyone or making things uncomfortable in the neighborhood. So I did what any reasonable person would do. I wrote emails, carefully worded, polite without being submissive, firm without being confrontational. I pointed out the exact sections of the HOA bylaws that limited their authority, quoting paragraph numbers and dates, not opinions. I attached copies of my purchase documents and gently reminded them that my property was not listed among the parcels governed by their exterior modification rules. I asked for a meeting, not to argue, but to talk it through face-to-face like adults. I even said plainly that if the gravel path somehow violated a rule I had genuinely missed, I was open to modifying it. I wanted resolution, not dominance. Pause. What I got back wasn't resolution. It was silence at first, the kind that feels deliberate rather than busy. Weeks went by without acknowledgement, even as new violation notices continued to appear. When someone finally did respond, the tone had shifted in a way that was hard to ignore. One email dismissed my concerns entirely and included a line about my grandfather's cabin being an eyesore that didn't fit the community's image. It wasn't just unprofessional. It was personal. That was the moment something inside me recalibrated. Not anger exactly, but clarity. This wasn't about rules or aesthetics. It was about someone deciding they had the right to belittle me and my property because they thought I'd roll over. Pause. After that, the pressure escalated quickly. The fines doubled, then tripled, each notice more aggressively worded than the last. There were vague references to further legal remedies and carefully phrased warnings about liens being placed on my property if I continued to ignore their demands. They started CCing their attorney on emails that didn't even warrant legal involvement. A quiet intimidation tactic meant to remind me who they thought held the power. It stopped feeling like bureaucratic overreach and started feeling coordinated, like they were following a playbook designed to exhaust and scare people into compliance. They weren't asking anymore. They were daring me to push back. Pause. That was when I stopped writing emails altogether, not because I ran out of things to say, but because I realized words weren't going to protect me here. Knowledge would. I started reading. Really reading, not just HOA bylaws, but state property, statutes, county zoning regulations, recorded plats, easements, right-of-way laws, and infrastructure records that most people never think to look for. I spent evenings hunched over scanned PDFs and old survey maps, cross-referencing parcel numbers and legal descriptions until my eyes ached. What I felt wasn't rage or panic. It was focus. A quiet, deliberate shift from hoping this would go away to understanding that I was standing on the edge of something, much larger than a gravel path or a patched roof. If they wanted to play authority games, I was going to meet them on the only field that actually mattered, the law, and I was going to do it patiently, carefully, and without making a sound until I was ready. Pause. I dove into the county archives with a kind of quiet determination. That surprised me, mostly because it didn't feel dramatic or emotional at all. It felt practical, almost mundane, like fixing a long-ignored leak before it rotted the beams. I requested copies of the original deed first, then kept going when I realized how much history was buried under assumptions everyone else had accepted without question. I pulled surveys from the early 1970s, hand-drawn plats with faded ink and surveyor notes scribbled in the margins, zoning. Ordinances that had been amended so many times they contradicted their own footnotes, and infrastructure records that referenced this land back when it wasn't a subdivision at all. I followed those threads further than I expected to, into old military land use documents, because portions of this area had once been designated for government access and utility corridors long before anyone imagined an HOA would exist here. None of it was exciting in the cinematic sense, but every document felt like another brick locking into place. Pause. Night after night, I sat at the dining room table surrounded by maps and folders, comparing yellowed paper to modern GIS overlays on my laptop, tracing boundary lines with my finger until I knew them better than my own signature. I learned the language of legal descriptions, the difference between assumed access and recorded right-of-way, how one poorly worded amendment could be used to bully people who didn't know. Better, I photographed every page, scanned every notice the HOA had sent, labeled everything by date and reference number, and began logging each interaction like evidence instead of correspondence. There was a strange calm in that process. While they were sending threats and posturing, I was building a timeline they couldn't talk their way out of. Pause. The social cost crept in slowly. Neighbors who used to wave or stop for small talk started keeping their distance, suddenly very interested in their phones or mailboxes when I walked by. No one wanted to be seen taking sides, and I couldn't blame them. At home, the shift was more personal. My partner worried about how much of our time this was consuming, about weekends disappearing into paperwork and late nights. My kids noticed, too, asking why I was always working even when I was home. I felt that weight, the quiet guilt of choosing preparation over comfort, but I also knew there wasn't. Another path that ended well. Letting this go would mean surrendering something fundamental, not just land, but agency. Pause. And the deeper I went, the clearer everything became. The HOA's claims didn't just feel wrong anymore. They were provably wrong. The original deeds explicitly granted access rights they had no authority to override. The road I built sat squarely within boundaries they had never legally controlled, and their own maps didn't even match the county's official surveys. Their confidence was built on assumptions, not law, and assumptions crumble the moment someone checks the source. I wasn't yelling, threatening, or making noise. I was quietly turning into a problem they hadn't planned for. The kind that doesn't go away when ignored. Every late night in those archives, every document cross-checked and cataloged, brought me closer to reclaiming something bigger than a gravel road. It was control over my own life again, earned patiently, line by line. Pause. The day I finally walked into the HOA board meeting, I didn't feel nervous the way I thought I might. What I felt was settled. Like everything had already happened, and this was just the part where reality caught up. I carried a binder under my arm, thick enough that it bowed slightly in the middle, the kind of weight that doesn't come from paper alone, but from certainty. Took a seat without asking permission, ignored the side glances, and waited until the president finished her well-practiced speech about violations, community standards, and unauthorized access. When she finally looked at me and demanded an explanation, I didn't argue or interrupt. I stood up, walked to the table, and placed the binder down between us with a soft, deliberate thud. Then I started opening it, slowly, laying the documents out one at a time, the way you would set down evidence, not accusations. Pause. First came the original deed, recorded long before the subdivision existed, clearly outlining the boundaries of the land I owned and the access rights attached to it. Then the county surveys, spanning decades, each one aligning, perfectly with the last, showing the same boundary lines they had conveniently ignored. I followed those with infrastructure records from 1972, stamped and filed, confirming that the road I built wasn't some rogue modification, but a lawful continuation of a recorded access route that had existed on paper longer than the HOA itself. The room grew quiet in that peculiar way it does when people realize they've misjudged someone. Chairs stopped creaking. Pens stopped clicking. The only sound was the soft shuffle of paper as the president flipped through pages faster and faster, her confident smile tightening, then disappearing altogether. Pause. Behind her, their lawyer leaned forward, scanning the documents with a furrowed brow that deepened by the second. I watched the color drain from his face as he reached the survey overlays and cross-referenced parcel numbers he already knew he couldn't dispute. He didn't say a word at first, just straightened his tie and cleared his throat like he was buying time. When he finally spoke, it wasn't to threaten or posture the way he had in emails. It was cautious, measured, and painfully restrained. I didn't need to respond. I hadn't come there to perform or dominate the room. I had come to end something. Pause. What struck me most in that moment was how small the whole thing suddenly felt. Months of intimidation, letters, fines, and legal bluster collapsed under the weight of records anyone could have found if they'd bothered to look. Everything the HOA had claimed authority over rested on assumptions and unchecked confidence, and all of it unraveled quietly, without Drama. Right there under fluorescent lights and folding chairs. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't ask for retractions. I simply closed the binder when they were done and sat back down. The balance of power didn't shift with a bang or a speech. It shifted because there was nowhere left for it to stand. And in that silence, it became unmistakably clear that the road they tried to charge me for wasn't just gravel and dirt anymore. It was proof, solid, documented proof, that their control over access, over my land, and over me had ended. Pause. After that meeting, the change didn't come with announcements or apologies. It came quietly, the way authority always retreats when it realizes it's been standing on nothing. The fines stopped first. No explanation, no follow-up letters, no administrative delay. They simply vanished. A few weeks later, word spread, never officially, just through the kind of careful whispers neighborhoods rely on, that the HOA president had resigned. There was no farewell email, no thank you for her service. She was just suddenly gone. The board members who had pushed the hardest, the ones who'd signed their names to the threats and postured behind legal language, either stepped down on their own or were voted out at the next election. People who had once spoken with certainty about rules and compliance grew very quiet when the subject came up. Pause. The neighborhood itself shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't celebratory. No one congratulated me or said I was right. Instead, there was a recalibration, like everyone was collectively deciding how to behave now that the illusion of control had cracked. Some neighbors started nodding when I drove past, small gestures, of acknowledgement that hadn't been there before. Others avoided eye contact entirely, suddenly finding reasons to turn away. I didn't take either personally. Respect doesn't always look friendly, and silence can be its own form of apology. What mattered was that the tension drained out of the air. The unspoken fear of arbitrary enforcement of being next seemed to lift. Pause. On my land, life returned to what it was always meant to be. Rebuilt the porch without submitting a single form or asking for permission that had never been required. No notices appeared. No warnings followed. The sound of hammers and saws was met with indifference instead of scrutiny. Weekends slowly stopped being consumed by paperwork and research and went back to what I'd wanted all along. Early mornings with coffee on the porch, afternoons down by the creek, evenings where the only thing I had to decide was whether to stay outside a little longer. The cabin felt like mine again, not just legally, but emotionally. Pause. Looking back, I understand now that I never wanted that fight, and I still don't think of it as one. I didn't win because I was louder, tougher, or more aggressive. I won because I was patient when they expected panic, quiet when they expected noise, and prepared when they assumed ignorance. The most effective kind of revenge isn't spectacle or humiliation. It's removing someone's power so completely that there's nothing left to fight over. Pause. When I drive down that road now, the same road they tried to charge me for, it feels different. Not because it changed, but because I did. It's no longer just a path through the trees. It's a reminder that control, respect, and peace aren't handed out by committees or enforced with fines. They're earned by knowing your ground, standing on it calmly, and refusing to move. And once you do that, everything else tends to fall back into place.